Welcome to a deep dive into how to win friends and influence people. Published back in 1937 and still a bestseller. It's a classic for a reason, you know?
Yeah, and it's incredible. Dale Carnegie was already figuring out, what makes people tick way back then.
Mhm.
Interviewing everyone from, big industrialists to,
To Hollywood stars.
yeah, looking for those universal principles of influence.
And the fascinating part is how much psychology backs up a lot of these principles. Like, we're not just going to rehash the book, but we'll connect it to the science behind why these techniques actually work.
Exactly. For example, you'll hear about, there's this notorious gangster named Two Gun Crowley who, even on his way to the electric chair, totally refused to take any responsibility for his actions.
Yeah, and it just makes you wonder, right? Why do we deflect blame even when it's clearly our fault?
Well, it's really a self-preservation thing. Our brains, they just hate admitting we're wrong. It sort of threatens our sense of self-worth.
So how do we overcome that, both in ourselves and in others? Carnegie's first principle is don't criticize, condemn, or complain.
Yeah.
It sounds simple, but really think about it. How often are we trying to change people by pointing out their flaws?
Yeah, it's tempting, but it just rarely works. Criticism, it just triggers defensiveness and resistance.
Yeah.
So instead of opening people up to change, it makes them just dig in their heels even more.
Yeah. Carnegie compares this to the Teapot Dome scandal, this massive political corruption case where there was so much evidence, but still nobody was held accountable.
Okay.
The officials involved just kept deflecting blame, and it made the whole thing even worse.
As a cautionary tale about how criticism, especially public criticism, can just backfire spectacularly.
So if criticism is off the table, what's the alternative? And Carnegie points to a fascinating figure, Abraham Lincoln. He was a master communicator, but it wasn't always like that. Early in his career, Lincoln, he was known for his sharp, cutting remarks, which really alienated people and created enemies. And he even wrote this scathing letter to General Meade after the Battle of Gettysburg, furious that Meade had let the Confederate Army get away. But here's the thing. Lincoln never actually sent that letter.
Interesting.
He realized that, a public dressing down wouldn't do any good. It would damage morale and potentially jeopardize future success.
It's a really crucial shift for Lincoln, right? Going from, those personal attacks to really prioritizing the bigger picture. A lesson for all of us, especially those in leadership positions.
Yeah, and Carnegie drives this point home with a powerful story called Father Forgets, which explores the lasting impact of criticism on a child. Our words, even when we think they're well-intentioned, can have unintended consequences.
It's a call for empathy and, consideration in how we communicate. Instead of trying to change people through criticism, maybe we can focus on understanding and acknowledging their perspective.
So if we're not criticizing, condemning, or complaining, what are we doing? That brings us to Carnegie's next principle. Give honest and sincere appreciation. And that's where the psychology of motivation comes in. Carnegie argues that deep down, everyone craves appreciation. It's just a basic human need. When it's met, it fuels our desire to connect and cooperate.
Makes sense.
It's not about flattery or empty compliments, though. It's about recognizing and acknowledging, the genuine good in others. And sometimes something as simple as a sincere smile can make all the difference.
There's actual science behind this, too. When we smile, our brains, they release endorphins, which are mood boosting, not just for us, but also for the people around us.
He shares a story about this department store manager who said she would rather hire a smiling clerk with minimal education than
a gloomy PhD.
Exactly. Showing you how much a positive attitude really matters.
And, even back then, they realized that this positivity, it can be conveyed through the phone. They used to train phone operators to smile while talking.
Because it came through in their voices, right?
Yeah. It's like a vocal handshake.
Yeah.
Setting the tone for a positive interaction.
There's a great story about a stockbroker who wasn't known for his cheerful disposition, right? He just wasn't. He decided to try to smile more.
Okay.
And it transformed his relationships at work, at home, even on his commute.
Wow. His wife probably thought he was a pod person or something.
Right. But his life improved just by choosing to be more positive. It shows that even if you have to fake it till you make it, a smile can have a real ripple effect on our own well-being and, on the people around us.
Like that old Chinese proverb, a man without a smiling face must not open a shop.
That's so true. Now on to the next principle, which might seem a little counterintuitive at first. Arouse in the other person an eager want.
Okay.
I know. You're probably thinking, doesn't that sound manipulative?
It does.
Yeah, but it's really about understanding motivation. Instead of focusing on what we want, we need to consider what the other person wants. How can we make our request align with their desires? Carnegie illustrates this with a story about his Uncle Andrew, who used to bribe kids to write him letters by appealing to their desire for pocket money. Simple example, but it illustrates the point beautifully.
Right.
And it applied to adults, too. Like Carnegie himself, he negotiated a lower rent for this lecture hall by focusing on the benefits the landlord would get.
Okay.
It wasn't about, like, pleading his case. It was about creating a win-win.
Sure.
And Carnegie even quotes Henry Ford on this. You know, the Henry Ford, the car guy. He said, "If there is any one secret of success, it lies in the ability to get the other person's point of view and see things from that person's angle as well as from your own."
Yeah, that's powerful. It's a reminder to step outside our own little bubble and really try to see the other person's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what are their needs, their motivations, their fears, their aspirations, all of it.
And when we do that, we can frame our requests in a way that, resonates with them. We can create that sense of mutual benefit and cooperation.
Exactly. In the book, Carnegie contrasts this like really poorly written advertising letter, which is all about what the company wants, with this brilliant job application letter that a woman named Barbara Anderson wrote.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Her letter focused on how her skills could benefit the bank, not on what she wanted from the job.
And I bet she got the job.
Well, she got interviews at 11 out of the 12 banks she applied to. Shows the power of understanding the other person's eager want, right?
Wow, that's incredible. It's about aligning our goals with theirs, creating a scenario where everyone feels like they're getting what they want. Okay, part 2. 6 ways to make people like you. This section is all about building those genuine connections. And, it all starts with a fundamental principle. Become genuinely interested in other people.
And it's you'd be surprised how often we just forget this basic truth.
Yeah.
We get so caught up in our own lives, our own worries, our own agendas, that we kind of forget to really connect with the people around us.
Right. We're all the stars of our own show, but Carnegie points out that being self-centered doesn't really make us very interesting to others. He even mentions the study. It found that I is the most frequently used word in phone conversations.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much are we actually listening and engaging versus just waiting for our turn to talk?
Exactly. And he uses a powerful example to show the consequences of being self-absorbed. He talks about Napoleon, who, despite all his power and achievement, died virtually alone with very few true friends.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that success isn't just about what we accomplish on our own. It's about the relationships we build along the way.
So how do we become more genuinely interested in others? It's not about faking it. It's about cultivating genuine curiosity, a desire to understand the people around us. And Carnegie shares these inspiring examples, like the story of Theodore Roosevelt.
Theodore Roosevelt, President, Rough Rider, and memory whiz.
Right. With his insanely busy schedule, he made a point of remembering even his servants' names and greeting them warmly.
Yeah, I mean, that really speaks volumes about his character. He understood that everyone, regardless of position, deserves respect and acknowledgement.
And Carnegie himself used this principle, to get all these busy authors to speak at his courses. Instead of just offering money, he expressed sincere admiration for their work.
Oh, okay.
Which made them feel valued and appreciated.
So it's about finding something to genuinely admire in others, even people we might not initially agree with.
Yeah. He also tells a story about this woman who opened an account at this bank simply because the manager remembered her mother's illness.
Wow.
That small act of remembering made her feel seen and cared for.
Yeah. It's a reminder that even the smallest gestures can have a lasting impact.
Absolutely. And sometimes that genuine interest can manifest in the most unexpected ways. Remember that story about the little girl who was hospitalized on Thanksgiving?
Oh, yeah.
She was so lonely and scared. But then this young nurse went above and beyond to comfort her, bringing her Thanksgiving dinner and playing games with her.
Oh, that's nice.
And the nurse stayed long after her shift was over, just to keep her company.
Mm-hmm.
It's a real testament to the power of human connection, of taking the time to see and care for another person.
Yeah.
And years later, that little girl, now a grown woman, still remembers that act of kindness.
It's powerful, right?
Yeah.
Our actions, even the seemingly small ones, they can have a ripple effect.
Okay, so we've talked about being interested in others, but how do we show it in a way that's meaningful and memorable? And that brings us to Carnegie's next principle. Remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language.
I'll admit I struggle with this one. Like, I'll meet someone new, 5 minutes later, poof, the name is gone.
Yeah.
But Carnegie says that remembering and using someone's name is more than just good manners. It's a real sign of respect.
Yeah. Think about it. Your name is your identity. It's how you define yourself in the world.
Yeah.
And when someone remembers our name, it just makes us feel seen. Yeah, he shares a story about this politician named Jim Farley who could remember 50,000 people by their first names.
Wow, that's incredible. I can barely remember what I had for breakfast.
Me neither. But even if we can't all be Jim Farley, we can make an effort to, step up our name game. And Carnegie gives some practical tips, like repeating the name several times during a conversation or associating it with a visual image, even writing it down as soon as possible.
Those are good tips.
Yeah. He even tells this funny story about this guy who noticed that the cafeteria lady at his work always had a scowl on her face.
Okay.
So one day, he decides to use her name when he orders his lunch. Suddenly, she's piling on the ham, giving him extra potato chips.
Wow. The name has power.
It's amazing, right? Such a simple gesture can really transform an interaction.
Sure.
And that brings us to a principle that's absolutely crucial, not just for winning friends, but for, effective communication in any setting. Be a good listener. Encourage others to talk about themselves.
It's funny. Carnegie admitted that he wasn't, naturally gifted conversationalist. He wasn't the life of the party or anything.
But he was considered a great conversationalist.
He was. Because he understood that the secret to good conversation isn't about being a great talker. It's about being a great listener.
Yeah.
He made people feel heard and understood, and that made him incredibly likable.
He even quotes Charles W. Eliot, the president of Harvard, who said that the most flattering thing you can do for someone is to give them your undivided attention.
Yeah, in our world of distractions, being fully present with someone, it's a rare and precious gift.
And it can be so effective in resolving conflict, too. There's this story about a businessman who successfully calmed down this furious customer simply by listening patiently to his complaints.
Oh, wow.
He didn't interrupt, didn't make excuses, just listened.
Yeah.
And that empathy disarmed the situation and allowed for a more, rational and productive conversation. And then there's a story of this young Western Union messenger who became super successful by asking famous people to tell him about themselves.
Oh, interesting.
He was so genuinely interested in their stories, and he ended up building relationships with, some of the most influential people of his time.
It shows the power of curiosity.
Right.
And just a willingness to learn from others.
Okay, ready for principle number 4. This one is about, shifting the focus away from ourselves, and toward the interests of the other person. Talk in terms of the other person's interests.
I like this one.
Right. This is about recognizing that everyone has their own passions, their own hobbies, things that light them up. And Carnegie tells this funny story about how he once bored a famous poet to tears by talking nonstop about himself and his work.
Oof. That's a rough one.
Awkward silence.
Yeah.
But then he realized his mistake, and he started asking the poet about his work, his inspirations, his creative process, and suddenly the conversation came alive.
Yeah, it's a reminder that, we can make ourselves more interesting to others by taking a genuine interest in what they care about.
He also shares this story about this bakery salesman who had been trying for years to sell bread to this one particular hotel manager, and he just couldn't, crack this guy.
Really?
Yeah.
Which finally changed his mind. A killer discount.
Nope. He discovered that the manager was super passionate about dogs and goldfish.
Okay.
So he started talking about those things. And all of a sudden, they had a connection. And the manager started seeing him as a person, not just a vendor. And finally, he agreed to buy the bread.
So it's really about finding that common ground, that shared interest that can just break down those barriers and build rapport.
Absolutely. And sometimes it takes a little research to discover those shared interests. He tells the story of Edward E. Harriman, who was looking for a job with this notoriously, inaccessible businessman named R.J. Funkhauser.
Okay. So how to get his foot in the door?
He did his homework. He learned everything he could about Funkhauser's interests. And when he finally got a meeting, he focused the conversation on those things. He even told Funkhauser that he admired his business acumen and wanted to learn from him.
Smart. He appealed to his ego.
Right. He presented himself as a student, not a threat.
Yeah.
And it worked. He got the job.
Wow. That just shows you the power of preparation and a willingness to go the extra mile to really understand the other person's perspective.
It's not just about landing jobs or closing deals, though. Carnegie shares this really heartwarming story about a teacher who motivated this shy, underperforming student by tacking into his passion for radio and TV.
Oh, cool.
Instead of focusing on his weaknesses, he encouraged his interests and helped him see how they could connect to his academic work.
That's awesome. That's a great example of how we can really inspire others by recognizing and nurturing those strengths and passions.
Okay, ready for principle number 5. This one taps into a deep human need. Make the other person feel important and do it sincerely.
Yeah, this is so important, right? Deep down, we all crave that validation and appreciation. We want to feel like we matter, like our contributions are valued.
Absolutely. And Carnegie argues that this desire is so strong, it can even drive seemingly irrational behavior. He tells this story about this woman who was given a valuable Packard car as a gift from her elderly aunt.
A Packard. Wow.
Simply because she had shown appreciation for the aunt's possessions.
Wow, talk about return on investment. But it shows you how much those small acts of kindness and appreciation can mean, especially to someone who feels, lonely or overlooked.
And it's not just about these grand gestures. Carnegie emphasizes that making people feel important can be, as simple as remembering their birthdays, asking about their families, or acknowledging their contributions, no matter how small.
Yeah, it's really about treating everyone with respect,
Mhm.
recognizing that inherent value as human beings.
He even tells a story about how he received this really scathing letter from a woman who was upset that he had made a geographical error during a radio broadcast.
Oh, no.
Right. His initial instinct was to defend himself, but then he realized that a more effective approach would be to simply apologize sincerely and acknowledge her perspective.
Yeah.
And that simple act of validation completely diffused the situation. He even ended up becoming friends with this woman.
That's a great example of how humility and empathy can really go a long way in building relationships.
So we've covered 5 principles so far, and they all kind of point to one central theme, right? It's about shifting our focus from ourselves to others.
Yeah, it's about cultivating that genuine interest, understanding their perspectives, making them feel valued and appreciated.
And, these principles, they're all interconnected. They build on each other, right?
Right.
Creating a powerful framework for building these stronger, more meaningful relationships.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you ready for the final principle in this section? It's a powerful one, and it ties back to the importance of active listening. Be a good listener. Encourage others to talk about themselves.
Wait, didn't we already cover this one?
We did. It seems like Carnegie felt it was so important it deserved to be mentioned twice.
Well, I can't argue with that. Listening is truly the foundation of any strong relationship.
Yeah.
But it's more than just being quiet while the other person's talking.
Right. It's about actively engaging with their words, asking questions, and showing that we're truly absorbing what they're saying.
Yeah.
Carnegie shares a story about this placement counselor who was initially really disliked by her colleagues because she was always bragging about her accomplishments.
Oh, no.
But then when she started listening and showing interest in her colleagues' achievements, she became the most well-liked person in the office.
Wow, that's a big turnaround. It shows you how just shifting our focus from ourselves to others can dramatically improve our relationships.
He also tells the story about Mr. Seltz, a businessman who was struggling to revitalize his company. And he finally turned things around when he started genuinely listening to his employees, making them feel like their opinions mattered.
That's a good reminder that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels valued and empowered to contribute.
And sometimes the best way to encourage people to talk about themselves is to just simply ask for their advice.
Oh,
Carnegie gives the example of Eugene Wesson, a salesman who finally closed a deal after years of trying by simply asking the buyer for his opinion on how to improve his product.
Oh, wow. He shifted the dynamic, right? Made the buyer feel like the expert, which ultimately led to the sale.
And finally, he shares this story about this family who planned their vacation by incorporating everyone's interests and making each member feel like their input was valued.
Yeah, it's a great example of how this principle can be applied to any area of our lives, not just business or, social settings.
Okay, time for part 3. How to win people to your way of thinking. This is where Carnegie gets into, the art of persuasion, but not in a manipulative way. It's more about understanding how to navigate disagreements and get your point across without, alienating people.
He starts right off with a principle that's become a classic. The only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it.
Which seems counterintuitive, right? Especially these days when everyone's got a strong opinion about everything.
Right.
But Carnegie, he was a debater himself, and he realized that arguments, they just rarely achieve anything positive.
Yeah, think about it. When was the last time you actually changed someone's mind by arguing with them?
Probably never.
Exactly. Arguments, they escalate, into these emotional battles. Logic goes out the window.
Yeah.
And even if you win the argument, you've probably damaged the relationship.
Carnegie says you can't win an argument. You can't, because if you lose it, you lose it, and if you win it, you lose it.
Because even if you've proven the other person wrong, you've probably just bruised their ego, created resentment.
Yeah, he tells this great story about a salesman named Patrick J. O'Hare who used to get into arguments with customers.
Oh, no.
He was afraid of rejection, so he would argue his way into a sale.
Okay, that's not the best strategy.
But then O'Hare learned a new approach. Instead of arguing, he started agreeing with the customer's objections.
Interesting. How'd that work for him?
Well, by acknowledging their concerns, he sort of disarmed the situation, right?
Yeah.
Created this opening for a more productive conversation, shifted the focus away from, confrontation toward finding common ground.
So it's not about suppressing disagreements. It's about approaching them in a way that's respectful and collaborative.
Exactly. And that brings us to the next principle, which builds on this idea. Show respect for the other person's opinions. Never say you're wrong. It's about recognizing that everyone's got their own perspective, shaped by their unique experiences and beliefs.
Right. Even if we disagree with that perspective, we can still respect the person who holds it.
Carnegie shares a story about his own encounter with a policeman who was really strict about this rule about dogs needing to be on leashes in the park.
Okay.
And at first, he tried to reason with him, but it just made things worse. So the next time he encountered the officer, he took a different approach. He acknowledged the policeman's authority, the importance of the rule, but he did it in a way that was respectful.
So what happened?
The policeman actually suggested a compromise. He said, you can let your dog run free in this certain area of the park where he won't be seen.
Wow. That's amazing. It really shows that respecting the other person's perspective, even when you don't agree with it, can make a huge difference.
And it's not just about avoiding conflict. It's about recognizing that people are more likely to, be open to our ideas if they feel heard and understood.
Right.
Carnegie also points out that people, they're not always driven by logic, right? Their opinions are often shaped by emotions.
Yeah, and preconceived notions.
He tells a story about a tax inspector who was really resistant to his arguments. But then Carnegie shifted his approach. He started expressing appreciation for the inspector's expertise, acknowledging the challenges of his job.
Oh, okay.
And that created a connection. The inspector, he felt respected. He was suddenly more open to Carnegie's perspective.
So it's a reminder that sometimes the best way to win someone over is to appeal to their heart, not just their head.
Exactly. Now, what happens when we're the ones who are wrong? That brings us to principle number 3. If you are wrong, admit it quickly and emphatically.
Okay. This one can be tough.
Yeah. Our egos hate admitting we're wrong.
For sure.
But Carnegie argues it's actually a sign of strength, It shows we're willing to learn and grow.
Right. And it disarms the other person, makes them less likely to attack.
He tells the story of Ben Franklin, who transformed himself from this, argumentative young guy into a respected diplomat by learning to admit his faults.
Ben Franklin, always a good example.
Right. Franklin realized that by acknowledging his mistakes, he could create a more constructive environment.
Yeah.
And Carnegie himself used this technique to diffuse this tense situation with a demanding client. He just quickly admitted his own mistake. It took the fight out of the client, and they were able to reach a solution.
It's a reminder that sometimes the best way to resolve a conflict is to just take ownership of our part in it.
And it sets a good example, encouraging others to do the same. Okay, speaking of setting a good example, that brings us to a principle that's so simple but often overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
Begin in a friendly way.
This is all about setting the tone, right?
Exactly. The way we start an interaction, it sets the tone for everything that follows.
Think about it. If someone comes at you with a scowl and a harsh tone, are you going to be receptive to what they have to say?
No way.
No. But if someone greets you with a smile, a friendly demeanor, you're much more likely to listen, even if you don't agree with them.
Carnegie gives the example of this engineer, O.L. Straub, who wanted to get his rent reduced.
Okay.
And he knew his landlord was a tough guy, so he wrote him this really friendly letter. He expressed appreciation for his service and then outlined his reasons for, wanting a rent reduction.
It's a good approach. A friendly approach can be much more effective than a confrontational one.
And then there's this great story about this salesman who he lost his voice during a crucial meeting with a client. But instead of panicking, he just wrote a note explaining his situation. And the client, impressed by his honesty, ended up doing the talking for him.
Wow, that's thinking on your feet.
Right. Sometimes our weaknesses can become our strengths if we handle them the right way. Okay, ready for the next principle. This one is about getting the other person on board with our ideas from the very start.
I'm listening.
The principle is, get the other person saying, yes, yes, immediately.
Okay.
And Carnegie explains that this is based on the idea that it's just easier to persuade someone when they're already in a state of agreement.
Got it. So build momentum toward that positive outcome.
Exactly. He even references Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher,
Wow.
who was known for asking these leading questions, guiding his students towards the desired conclusion.
That's subtle but powerful. You get them agreeing to smaller points, and that paves the way for the big one.
Right. Carnegie doesn't go into a ton of detail on this one, but he emphasizes that, finding common ground, building rapport, that's essential for effective persuasion.
Sure.
Okay, on to the next one. Let the other person do a great deal of the talking.
This ties back to what we were talking about before about being a good listener.
Exactly. Carnegie argues that people are just more likely to be persuaded by, ideas that they feel like they came up with.
Right.
So it's about creating an environment where they feel empowered to share their thoughts.
He's got a good point.
He tells the story of this placement counselor who was initially, really disliked by her colleagues because she was always bragging about her accomplishments.
Oh, no. Not a good look.
But then she started listening to her colleagues and, encouraging them to talk about their achievements.
Yeah.
And she became the most well-liked person in the office.
Wow. Another big turnaround. It shows you that sometimes the best way to win people over is to just give them space to be themselves.
Exactly. And that leads us to a principle that's, insightful and a little bit Machiavellian. Let the other person feel that the idea is his or hers.
I see. It's like planting seeds, right? Guiding the conversation so they reach the conclusion on their own.
He even quotes Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, "In every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty."
That's a great quote. It means we're more likely to embrace those ideas that we feel we've discovered ourselves.
Carnegie tells this story about Colonel Edward M. House, who had a lot of influence over President Woodrow Wilson.
Okay. What was his secret?
Well, he presented his ideas to Wilson in such a way that Wilson thought they were his own ideas.
Wow. That's masterful.
It's about understanding that people are more likely to support ideas, if they feel like they own them.
Makes sense.
He also shares a story about this guy, Sam Douglas, who learned to avoid arguments with his wife about her gardening by complimenting her and making her feel like, her ideas for the garden were the best.
Good strategy.
Right. So this principle applies in our personal lives too, not just business. Okay, another principle coming up. This one's a classic. Try honestly to see things from the other person's point of view.
Empathy. About stepping outside of our own, limited perspective and seeing the world through the eyes of another.
More than just putting ourselves in their shoes, it's about genuinely trying to understand their thoughts and feelings.
Right.
And he tells this great story about his experience with a really dissatisfied customer. This guy was angry, resistant. But when Carnegie really tried to understand his point of view, acknowledge his feelings, the whole situation changed.
So he calmed down.
Totally. The customer went from being an adversary to a friend. Even a loyal customer.
Empathy. It's amazing. It can really diffuse conflict and build bridges.
Okay, moving on to principle number 9. Be sympathetic to the other person's ideas and desires.
This one builds on the last one.
Right. Exactly. It's about not just understanding, but validating their feelings.
Yeah.
Carnegie, he gives us this really powerful phrase that kind of sums it up. I don't blame you one iota for feeling as you do. If I were you, I would undoubtedly feel just as you do.
It's great,
Right. It's like saying, hey, your feelings are valid.
even if you don't agree with them.
Exactly. He shares this story about how he got all these angry letters after he made a geographical error during a radio broadcast.
Oh, boy.
And his first instinct, is to defend himself, be like, come on, people, it's not a big deal.
Yeah.
But then he realized the better approach was just to apologize sincerely, express understanding for their perspective.
Made that work.
Completely disarmed the situation. He also tells a story about President Taft, who got this really harsh letter from this woman who was upset that he hadn't given her son a government job.
Oh, wow.
Taft's first reaction was to write back this, sharp rebuke, but he put the letter aside for a few days, and when he reread it, he was like, meh, I'm going to take a different approach.
So he wrote her a polite letter.
Yeah, expressing understanding for her disappointment. And guess what?
What?
She actually apologized for her harsh words.
It's a reminder that sometimes the best way to win someone over is to meet them where they are emotionally.
All right, next principle. This one's about appealing to people's, better angels.
Okay, I'm interested.
Appeal to the nobler motives.
Okay.
Carnegie argues that deep down, most people, they want to do the right thing. Be fair, be helpful, make a difference.
So tap into their idealism.
Yeah, he shares the story about how he resolved this dispute with a customer by appealing to the guy's sense of fairness. He just asked the customer to adjust the bill as if he were the president of Carnegie's company.
Wow, okay. And that worked.
It did. The guy agreed, and he even became a loyal friend of the company.
That's incredible. It's like a simple appeal to someone's better nature can really have such a big impact.
And he gives examples of how this principle has been used throughout history. He tells the story of John D. Rockefeller Jr., who stopped a bunch of photographers from taking pictures of his kids by appealing to their concern for kids' well-being.
Smart. He didn't make it about himself or his privacy. He made it about a shared value.
And he also talks about Cyrus H.K. Curtis, founder of the Saturday Evening Post. He couldn't afford to pay his writers big salaries, so he offered to donate to their favorite charities instead.
That's a good way to do it.
Right. It's a reminder that sometimes the most persuasive arguments are those that tap into our shared values.
Okay, what's next?
This one's about making our ideas more memorable, more impactful.
Okay, tell me more.
Dramatize your ideas.
Oh, I like the sound of that.
Carnegie says we're just more likely to remember things if they're presented in a vivid way,
So use storytelling, imagery, that kind of thing.
Exactly. He talks about this salesman, Jim Yimans, who sold cash registers. And to show clients how much money they were losing with their old machines, he would dramatically throw a handful of pennies on the floor.
Visual aid.
Right. And he tells this other story about a cold cream salesman who convinced this skeptical buyer to try his product by dumping 32 jars of the competition's cold creams on his desk. Each one had a tag with the results of a trade investigation.
Wow. That's bold.
But it worked.
It shows the power of visuals, right? You gotta grab their attention.
Okay, next up. Throw down a challenge.
This one sounds interesting.
Carnegie says people are motivated by this desire to prove themselves, to rise to a challenge.
Yeah, it's like the competitive spirit. Think about all the great things that have been achieved because of a challenge, climbing Mount Everest, landing on the moon.
Exactly. Carnegie shares this story about Charles Schwab, the steel magnate. He motivated his employees by encouraging competition between departments.
Yeah, little friendly rivalry.
And Carnegie brings in a historical example, too. When Theodore Roosevelt was thinking about withdrawing from the race for governor of New York, his opponent, Thomas Platt, he challenged his courage.
Oh, how did he do that?
He basically said, is the hero of San Juan Hill a coward?
Wow. Not subtle.
And that challenge spurred Roosevelt to stay in the race. And of course, he eventually became president.
It shows that a well-timed challenge can really light a fire under people.
All right, what's next? This one builds on some of those earlier principles. Begin with praise and honest appreciation.
So start on a positive note.
Carnegie says criticism works best when it's sandwiched between praise.
The compliment sandwich.
Right. He tells a story about this bank manager, Dorothy Wroblewski, who helped an employee who was struggling.
Okay.
She started by praising the employee's strength and then offered guidance on the task she found difficult.
It's a much more supportive approach than just, pointing out flaws and making people feel bad.
And way more effective. What's next? Call attention to people's mistakes indirectly.
Okay, this is about being tactful.
It's about addressing the issue without making the other person feel attacked.
So how did you do that?
Carnegie tells this story about how his niece, who was a piano teacher, convinced a student to cut her fingernails.
Okay.
She acknowledged how beautiful they were and framed it as like a sacrifice the student was making for her music.
Oh, clever.
He also tells this story about Fyodor Chaliapin, a famous opera singer who always canceled shows, claiming he was sick.
Oh, no.
His manager, Saul Hurok, learned to deal with this by playing along, expressing sympathy for his illness, and making him feel really important.
And that worked.
Totally. He basically tricked him into performing.
It's like reverse psychology.
Okay, next one. Talk about your own mistakes first. This one's about leading by example.
Right. Show that you're human, you make mistakes too.
He shares a story about his niece again and how he realized he shouldn't hold her to the same standards as himself. He tells this other story about Clarence Erhusen, who wanted his son to stop smoking.
Okay.
Instead of lecturing him, he admitted his own struggles with smoking, how hard it was to quit.
That's really powerful. By being vulnerable, he made the message much more relatable.
And it worked. The son was really moved and decided to quit himself.
All right, what's next?
Ask questions instead of giving direct orders.
Okay, this is about giving people autonomy, right?
Yeah.
Making them feel like they're part of the decision.
He shares the example of Owen D. Young, a successful businessman who almost never gave direct orders. He always offered suggestions and asked for opinions.
That's a great leadership style.
All right, next principle. Let the other person save face.
This is about preserving dignity, right?
No one likes to be publicly humiliated. Carnegie tells a story about Charles Steinmetz, this brilliant but ineffective manager. They wanted to remove him from his position, but they did it gracefully, giving him a new title so he didn't lose face.
That's a much better way to handle it.
And that brings us to a principle that's all about the power of positive expectations. Give the other person a fine reputation to live up to.
Okay. This is about believing in people's potential.
He tells a story about this difficult student who completely turned things around when he was given a reputation for being cooperative.
Oh, wow. So our beliefs about people can really become like self-fulfilling prophecies.
And finally, use encouragement. Make the fault seem easy to correct.
Okay, so focus on strengths and make improvement seem achievable.
He tells a story about a dad who helped his son get better at math by using flashcards and positive reinforcement. He made it fun.
That's a great approach.
So that's it. All 12 principles from part 3. How to win people to your way of thinking. What a journey.
Yeah, Carnegie's book is just full of these amazing insights, and it's incredible how relevant they still are today.
So what does all this mean for you, our listener? We've given you a lot to think about, but hopefully you've gotten some tools that you can start using in your own life, right away.
Yeah. Whether it's improving your communication, building relationships, or becoming a more effective leader, Carnegie's principles can really help.
It all starts with understanding that people are driven by emotions and desires.
And when we tap into those emotions, appeal to their better nature, treat them with respect, we can create a more harmonious world.
So I'd encourage you, pick one principle from today's deep dive and really try to use it this week. Pay attention to how it changes your conversations.
You might be surprised.
And be sure to share your experiences with us. We want to hear how you're putting Carnegie's principles into action.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Keep winning friends and influencing people.